Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We're here in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. We're going to be taking a tour of the Spartan homeland, and I'm joined by the historian Roel Konijnendijk, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Roel Konijnendijk, and I'm a historian of classical Greek history, especially warfare and Sparta. And I'm here to introduce you to the site and the environment of ancient Sparta.
Yes, and he's been the researcher and writer who's been helping us on a lot of our recent episodes on ancient Greece and the Spartans. So this is an awesome experience. So he'll be kind of walking us through the Valley of Sparta. We'll go down at various levels. We're going to start here from the map view. Then we're going to fly over this area with bird view, and then we'll drop in and actually walk throughout Sparta from first person. So at a macro level, do you kind of want to tell us what's going on here and maybe comment on the accuracy of the game thus far?
Yeah, so I mean, this is basically the southern Peloponnese. So you've got a couple of these long mountain ranges that create these long peninsulas down the south, and in between them you have large fertile valleys. And one of those is basically the valley in which Sparta is situated. And we now call it Laconia, that's the modern name. Actually, there's not really an ancient name for it. There's a lot of confusion about what to call this space. But basically, this is the main sort of territory of the city-state of Sparta and the communities that it has subjected. And then in the course of the Archaic period, they also extend their rule further to the west towards Mycenaean. They conquer that whole fertile plain and the islands off the coast there. And then also further to the east, the Theater, which is the area between them and Argos, which kind of consolidates Spartan rule over the entire southern half of the Peloponnese. But their own heartland is that sort of area, that flat area around the river Eurotas, which is a stretch of really quite fertile farmland, where there has been this settlement has been sort of growing up since the end of the Bronze Age, basically, and that gradually congeals into the city of Sparta.
Yeah, and I wanted to say a couple of things that are really awesome when you see this, Sparta in 3D in a game that you can walk through. Is it really makes the geography pop out, which you otherwise don't appreciate. And that to me is one of the kind of key things about Sparta is you really realize, I mean, they're nestled into this tiny valley here. Obviously, it's compressed in the game. In reality, it's about, Sparta's 60 kilometers or so inland. But it really goes to show that, getting to Messenia, which isn't necessarily that far as the crow flies, is actually quite far.
Yeah, Mount Taygetos is like a serious mountain range, so you're not talking about an easy stroll there. Those mountains are like 2.5-3 kilometers high.
Yeah, that's insane. And then on top of that, there's other kind of pinch points which are critical to Sparta's history. The exits to the Valley of Laconia being very important. The fights over Tegea and other of the communities just outside of it was quite important. And if you could bottle up Sparta and hold the gates there, you could kind of keep them contained to their local area.
Yeah, so I mean, later on in the classical period, they learn quite quickly that if they can just block those passes, then they can keep invaders out as well. So that's usually the key point where, as long as Sparta can hold those places, like the interior remains untouched. Which is one of the reasons why they were able to, to survive as a city without a wall, basically, which we'll get to in a minute.
Right, if they have a natural geographic wall already enclosing them. So let's go ahead and drop into a bird view here in just a second. I guess the other thing to communicate real briefly is there's a couple other points here highlighted. We're going to be mostly looking at Sparta proper, which is a series of villages, but a couple things of note, at least I think you wanted to point out, was a couple little towns on the outskirts, and these represent the wider community, the Perioikoi communities and all that.
Yeah, so you've got down in the south there, you've got a Perioikoi community called Githaion, which is basically the military harbor of Sparta. It gets burned down a couple of times in the Peloponnesian War. Basically, the Athenians sort of sail up and tear it all down. But that is basically throughout this period, that's where the Spartans have their warships. But it is an independent community. So these are perioikoi. These are people who are subjected to Sparta. They're not politically autonomous, but they are independent, freeborn. They only owe military service to Sparta, basically. And then the rest of that valley is basically inhabited by the Helots who serve the Spartans as enslaved underclass.
And actually here I'll show the harbor of Sparta miniaturized a little bit, but at least it gives you a sense of the community here.
And there are cities like this sort of scattered all around the Eurotas Valley and also into Messenia. There are just perioikoi towns everywhere, some of them deliberately settled by the Spartans from people moving in from elsewhere. They'll just go live in our territory. It increases their manpower reserves, and it also increases their ability to control the Helots when they live in other communities, because these smaller freeborn communities will obviously help them to sort of keep those other populations down.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things you miss again when you're kind of looking at Greece from a macro level. You always hear about these central cities, the famous polis, Sparta, Argos, Athens, all that, but you miss out on the huge amount of tiny communities that were everywhere and that actually were quite important for, like you said, fielding the larger land armies as confederations. You relied a lot on these smaller entities that otherwise they get overlooked.
Yeah, and throughout the Laconike, so the territory of Sparta, there are something like 79 known places, and that's just one area, right? So there's anything from like a place that has a notable building or temple or something, to just actual villages and towns scattered about this area. Like, you have to imagine Sparta itself is really, really small, and it's 64 kilometers inland, and all of that land and much more beyond it. They have to control it somehow. Obviously, a lot of that is just going to be land that is worked by local communities, some of which are free, some of them are enslaved. And much of that is just indirect rule from the center.
Yeah, and then I guess scattered around, not only do you have these communities, but you have kind of older temples, tombs, and perhaps structures like we're seeing here, which I think we speculated was perhaps an attempt to do the Temple of Menelaus, or the shrine, I guess.
Yeah, so like in the territory of Sparta, there were a couple of ruins of these old Bronze Age palaces, and one of them, later Spartans claimed that this was the old palace of Menelaus, and so they built a temple there, which was the temple to Menelaus and Helen, whom they regarded as the sort of patron divinities of Sparta. And basically claiming that connection obviously gives you a lot of prestige, because then you can point to Homer, the story that every Greek knows, and you can say, hey, look, that's our Lord, our king, our ancestor.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess as we've been talking about communities sprinkled everywhere, over time they would have grown, some of them coalescing together, and that's of course the kind of the famous story of Sparta, where it's actually not just a single community, but I think 4 or 5 known villages that come together. So now as Sparta comes into view, maybe we can talk a bit about that idea.
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned this earlier, like it's just a long development of these small villages growing up in this valley and eventually sort of coalescing into something like an urban center. But there are other places in the Greek world where this is much more clearly the case, like in places like Corinth, or much more so on roads, for instance, where they actually up sticks and move together to a new place where they make a new city. In this case, it's really quite a loose agglomeration where these towns slowly grow together into something like a single urban area, or at least 4 of these villages. But they don't really form a sort of solid urban nucleus, which is usually marked out by a city wall and other monumentalization. So they remain kind of loosely gathered, small, not very remarkable villages. 4 of them bunched together around the Acropolis, and then one that is like 6 kilometers further south, but still counts as part of Sparta somehow. The town of Amiclai, which I think, these couple of houses here represented on the map.
And I guess what's interesting also is what that leads to is, like you said, for one, you don't have the massive city walls. Another is you don't have as much of the centralization, pooled resources that leads to monumental architecture and all that in other areas. And I think you had a quote about someone from the past remarking on, well, if someone takes a look at Sparta in the future, they're going to be quite shocked.
Yeah, so Thucydides, the famous Athenian historian, actually in the beginning of his work somewhere, he remarks that if somebody were to, like, if Athens and Sparta were both abandoned today and were found again as they are now, like by later people, then people would look at Athens and say, wow, these people must have been so powerful. They must have been like enormously mighty and conquered whole areas and ruled the world. Whereas when they looked at Sparta, he said, they would think that they would never believe that Sparta had any power at all. They would think that this was just some poor, insignificant little town. Mm-hmm. So he said something like they would believe that Athens was twice as powerful as it really was, but Sparta only half as powerful or even less,
Yeah.
Not significant at all.
Yeah, and we don't have too much time to go into the reasons why. I think we've listed that out in some other videos, so you guys can check that out. But let's go ahead and start to dive a little bit deeper into the city of Sparta. And I guess a couple things to note before we go into first person is we could just fly over here, take a look at things. There's going to be a large entry structure, and most of this that we're marking looking at Sparta is kind of going to be made up because the actual archaeology around Sparta right now is almost non-existent.
Yeah, so there are a couple of problems with the site of Sparta, one of which is that there is a modern town on top of it called Sparti, which is just literally a refoundation of Sparta in the modern era. Because the town was completely abandoned in the medieval period and it's just refounded in the 19th century. And the other part is that it's frankly not a very remarkable site. Like there's not a lot of monumental architecture, which means there's not a lot of tourists being drawn to it, which also means there's not a lot of investment or not a lot of resources available to try and excavate it in more detail. So a lot of the things that we want to know and that we know for other towns are quite uncertain when it comes to Sparta. We don't really know where the buildings are, what kind of buildings they are. A lot of things by now have been identified, but like huge swathes of the urban area are completely unactivated.
So some of the bigger ones being the Hippodrome, the theater, and I guess the main Acropolis and temple.
Yeah, although almost all of the structures that you're seeing here date to later periods. So when Sparta had fallen from grace, declined in power in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, they started to behave and appear more like a regular Greek city, which also involved first building a city wall, which they did in the 3rd century, and also building big monumental buildings to express their shared Greekness and their ability to compete with other states in this kind of, in the trappings of Greek culture. So they were starting to monumentalize things like theaters, temples, public buildings, that kind of thing. So that's all later. Like this period, this game is set in the Peloponnesian War. So a lot of these buildings that you see here down below in like stone and marble actually should be in much, much simpler, more temporary arrangements. So, benches made of wood or buildings made of mud brick and wood. Nothing very permanent.
Cool. And with that being said, let's go ahead and go back into finally keep dropping in layers of levels of specificity here. And let's finally take a look at Sparta in first person. So this is going to be the first entrance. Again, as we keep stating, this is pretty much all made up. But you'd imagine there'd be some main entryways into Sparta. And do we know anything about that? I know there's a bridge to the northeast that's important. But beyond that, do we know anything about gateways or control points?
Well, because the city doesn't have a gate, and because the city doesn't have a plan either, so there are no planned roads or avenues or anything like that like you get in other Greek cities. So there isn't really much of an opportunity to say, oh, this is where the urban center starts. This is more going to be something more like, houses becoming denser and the village edge at some point becoming apparent. And those points would usually be marked just by statues of gods that are meant to be patrons of the city. So in Sparta in particular, they would have statues of Apollo there to greet visitors and to let people know that this was the edge of the city. So these kind of huge monumental gateways with giant columns, and especially those banners, have no historical background whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, this is more stripped out of the Parthenon, I think, that monumental entrance.
Yeah, so this is something you see on the Acropolis in Athens, but in Sparta there is nothing like this. I don't think, to be honest, there ever was. Even in the Hellenistic and Roman period, they would never build anything like this. Just because they either no longer had the means to do it, or because that was just not the way they were monumentalizing it.
And I guess, assuming we were to go back in time and walk through Sparta, as we start from the outskirts out there in the farmland and stuff, you might see helots, you might see perioikoi, but getting to the city proper, would you still see both of those sorts of individuals milling about, or would it be strictly limited to Spartiates?
Well, actually, you would see a lot of different people milling about. So this is the town where the Spartiates live, right? So this is a community entirely of these leisure class citizens. But of course, they're not allowed to have any jobs. They're not allowed to do any work for a living. So they need to have all these other people to do that kind of stuff for them. So there's a very famous story in Xenophon where he describes how when you go to the Agora, you can carry the number of Spartiates count the number of Spartiates on your fingers, but you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of helots and perioikoi there. So even in their own urban center where most of them lived, and where they lived required by law to live, they would be heavily, heavily outnumbered by all the people that they were ruling over and oppressing.
And that's why the fear of the revolts was so strong.
Yeah, although, that's overstated. So there's an older theory in scholarship that says that Spartans were constantly living in fear of helot revolt and rebellion. Modern scholarship has really toned that down a lot. So more recent scholarship has basically said, actually, there are plenty of cases where helot revolts either don't break out or actively are, betrayed by other helots, because a lot of them were actually loyal to the regime. And this is obviously something that can easily be shown with comparative studies of other oppressed and even enslaved populations, is that very large numbers of them were either complicit in the hope of gaining some kind of advantage, or were simply oppressed to the point where they were not even thinking of conceiving of a different order.
And do we know what Sparta had in terms of like a police force for domestic security?
Allegedly, although, I mean, that police force is very, very poorly attested. The Crypteia, this idea of certain young Spartiates being trained to basically go out and terrorize the Helots. I mean, we hear of that from very late sources, and most of them disagree over what the nature of this organization actually was. So it seems like most of the policing was actually done by the Royal Guard.
That's right. Yeah, and we covered that a bit in our episode. And I guess here, as we're making our way through Sparta, they have a couple instances of just citizens presumably training for combat. Maybe we can remark a little bit on that.
Well, a remark on how that didn't happen. I mean, this is the thing, that we have no evidence of Spartans training with weapons. So this kind of picture of them sort of going at it with these little dummies, with training with swords and spears, there's simply no evidence of this. And you can obviously suggest that this must have happened because, like, they were preparing for war, right? That was all they did. But in practice, that would have taken the form of just general athletics and training as a group to function as a unit. So this kind of combat training that you see here, we know that from Roman legionaries, but we have no earlier source of any other ancient army doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. I mean, yeah, this is depicted and pretty well attested to from the Roman era, but even then, it's not akin to how you do weapons training, in the modern era. This, when the Romans would do it, it would be often with wooden swords, equipment that was heavier, and it was all about just conditioning your body, getting muscle memory and all that. It's more about fitness as opposed to learning how to strike precisely in a certain place. It's not at all like, you go in a target range and try and be a ninja or anything. So it's more of an exercise.
It's really important to bear in mind, like when you read Greeks talking about warfare, talking about fighting, they never emphasize the ability to do things well. Like, it doesn't really matter how good you are with a spear or a sword. Like, what matters is, will you stand your ground when your enemy's coming at you and screaming at you or shooting at you with like bows and slingshots and whatnot. So like the whole concept for them of what makes a good warrior is, somebody who doesn't get tired, somebody who doesn't get like overcome by hunger or thirst very easily, can bear the heat, can bear long marches, and can bear to look the enemy in the face.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. And I was going to make my way over to the Hippodrome there, but I guess we can stop here. Tomb of Leonidas.
Oh, hello. So there are actually two big tombs that were in the center of Sparta, the one of Leonidas and the one of Pausanias, the victor of the Battle of Plataea. So those were the two sort of great heroes of the Persian Wars. Obviously, those would have been quite simple tombs. We don't really know how well embellished they were, but they have been excavated, and they were probably quite sort of small monumental buildings. So they made the huge show out of it here, but in reality, this would have been quite a small sort of solemn place in the middle of the city, which was the site of later periods of the annual games in honor of Leonidas.
And I think you told me also that there was the names of the 300 Spartans inscribed at the base of the monument, or one of them.
Yeah, so there was. We are told that there was a sign here, and we know that it was there because Herodotus says that he learned the names of the 300 men who died at Thermopylae because there was a monument that listed them. But of course, unfortunately, he didn't repeat the names, and the monument is lost. But that would have been there, so there would have been a list of the names and patronymics of the 300 who died.
And I guess we can make our way past that to the Hippodrome, which we do know Sparta had. As you always tell me when we talk about Sparta, the citizens themselves were very much a leisure class, trying to do the things that elites in other cities would do. A big part of that is going to be chariot racing.
Yeah, so I mean, this might be a stadium rather than a hippodrome, but definitely these kind of spaces were used to essentially show off your leisure class chops, basically by, being athletic, being physically, in peak condition and beautiful. Those were the aspirations of the Greek elite. And then, if you were very wealthy, you would raise horses, and you would train those horses to draw a chariot in which you could compete in the games, in the great Panhellenic games, to show off your wealth and your status in front of the other Greeks, basically. And this was something that the Spartans were particularly fond of because they were a society of leisure class citizens. So they were very frequently victors at the Olympic Games, and the chariot race in particular, which is the competition that requires least sort of physical skill and most wealth, essentially, is the rich man's sport par excellence.
Got it. And we can see here a bunch of people training with doing various things, running, jumping, discus, throwing a ball. Do we have any evidence of particular types of workouts that they would do? Or I thought I remember hearing somewhere that there was like a circuit around Sparta that they would run.
I mean, later sources tell us about some of those games, but it's not really clear when those were introduced. So we do hear in the classical period they would play ball games, so that's probably represented here. And one of the terrible things that somebody who had fled from battle would have to suffer is that nobody would talk to him, nobody would give him fire, and he would get picked last at ball games.
Oh.
Which is, it's such a delightful little thing that Xenophon tells us, where you're just like, oh, I remember that from school, that's horrible. But yeah, so these are the disgraces that they can inflict on you. But there are later sources that describe more elaborately, like games where they would sort of go onto an island and then one group of boys would have to push the other group off and things like that. But mostly these people here in the gymnasium would probably just be practicing generally like their skills at boxing, wrestling, running, discus throwing, javelin throwing. We know that Spartans also did this on campaign. At one point, the Spartan general got caught out. He was practicing the discus with his buddy when the Persians rocked up and basically just killed him.
Oh.
So these kind of things are, very important for a Spartan to show his leisure class lifestyle.
Understood. And I have a question also as we're walking about, we've talked about, who you might see lying around, Pyrrhokoi, Helots, Spartans, and all that. One other kind of distinction that I would ask about is the women. I know in Athens and some other Greek cities, the women were kind of sequestered away. Was that the same in Sparta, or were they more out and about?
Well, so there's an ideal that the Greeks had, and the Spartans really would have had that as well, that women, like elite women, were not supposed to be seen outside the house because that was just not proper. But, I mean, in both societies, that was obviously practically impossible because women were also providers of labor and members of the community who had both public roles to play and also private lives to live, so you couldn't just keep them indoors. But also at Sparta, they were generally considered to be more liberated in the sense that they were more actively involved in public life, that they had more of a political voice, at least in private, through informal pressure on their husbands, and in which they could own property as well, which is one of the things that set Sparta apart from other Greek communities. Although we should kind of not overstate that too much. But one fun thing actually that would happen later, like after the Peloponnesian War, is that, for instance, one of the Spartan women, who was the sister of a Spartan king, her name is Kiniska, she became the first woman to sponsor a chariot team for the Olympics and actually win. And so in this site, like where we are now in the game, in later times, there would be a monument to her for her victory, basically, for the glory she brought onto the women of Sparta.
That's awesome. And now I guess what we're seeing here is some structures. I assume if we step inside, there's not going to be too much detail. But what kind of structures would we expect in the main polis of Sparta? Is this mostly going to be habitation and manufacturing centers, or what would we expect here?
You wouldn't expect much manufacturing because, as we said before, like these are the houses of the Spartiates themselves, who were not allowed. Like by law, they were banned from having any profession, which means that anything that had to be made for them, any kind of product, tools, etc. I mean, unless their women made them at home, which obviously happened a lot in many Greek communities, like both women and household enslaved people would make things at home, but the rest of it would have to be brought in from outside. So that would be, those kind of workshops would be in Piraeoic communities. So the city of Sparta would be mostly residential. They would be like small houses, and then the streets would be lined with like the tombs and shrines and statues of the great heroes of the legendary Greek Spartan past, basically.
Got it.
And like the kind of house that you saw just now is kind of representative, I guess, with the wooden pillars and the simple mud brick plastered walls.
And I think when we had toured this before recording the video, there were some good houses to demo over here. So let's go ahead and kind of see what the daily life of a Spartan might be. So I'm a rich Spartan. I've come back from the fields with my horses, my chariot racing, whatever. Come back to my house. And am I living in my own building that I own with my family, or did they kind of extended family homes? What was that unit like?
That's a good question, actually. I mean, most of them would have their own little compounds. They would probably be family houses, although with partible inheritance, you end up having more housesteads for nuclear families as they become adults. So you wouldn't really have that many generations living in a single household. So you'd have these kinds of houses, which would basically be built around a courtyard entrance, which would have like very simple, like this, with rooms, like mud brick walls to surround a small courtyard with rooms on all sides, and then the rooms at the ground floor would be usually like the quarters for the staff and enslaved people and like storage. And then upstairs you would have the rooms for the owners of the house, the head of the household. And usually the women's quarters would be upstairs because they would then be further away from the road, further away from public access, basically.
Hey, this is illegal, right?
Oh no, I mean, obviously pottery would have to be made locally.
Oh, okay.
So you have imported pottery, of course, like luxury pottery, especially in the classical period, is very predominantly Athenian. So everybody's just importing this Athenian stuff or mimicking it. But that's luxury pottery with like figures on the outside. But you have to imagine, like, pots in this period are all of the storage is pots, most of the cooking, most of the tableware, like all of this stuff is just pottery. So you'd be going through a lot of it, just everyday use. So you want to be making it locally. And obviously that's not going to be a Spartan doing that there. That's going to be some local guy, maybe a Helot, maybe somebody like from a Perioic community who just makes his living like making pots for people because they need pots every day. And there's mass production pottery. There's pottery that just gets made for single use, because it's cheap, it's easy. If you don't want much, if you don't care for decoration or symmetry or anything, it's cheap to make. So.
Oh, excuse me. So I'm just taking a look around, and yeah, this is pretty typical of what you're talking about, where lots of houses, mostly elites living here, and then sprinkled throughout small little shrines and religious
areas. So
areas.
That's a herm there. That's a boundary marker usually. Like these are like these little statues which they've cleaned up and made PG because usually they would have a big erection stuck on the front.
Okay.
These are like statues of Hermes or some protective deities that were meant to sort of mark boundaries and ward off evil spirits from communities. Yeah, I mean, all these people sort of working in the road, I don't really know if that's realistic. They obviously wanted to make it look quite lively. I think in real life you'd probably end up having a lot of that kind of activity contained to public spaces like the Agora, whereas in these smaller townships you wouldn't see that much of it going on. Like most people would be either working indoors on like private production, cleaning, weaving, that sort of thing, or they would be out and about. They would be meeting their friends, they would be out working in the fields, etc. Like, especially for men, life was supposed to be mostly outdoors, mostly, in the community.
Understood. And I'm looking around as we visit. So we've talked a bit about the different types of buildings. And one of the things I wonder is, was there like garrisons or barracks or something for the Spartan year groups to grow up in and have their communal, mess halls and all the stuff that we hear about?
Yeah, so I mean, there must have been some buildings for these little mess groups, these tent groups, because they were required to eat there every night, and those aged 20 to 30 were required to sleep there as well. But we don't actually hear of major structures for this. There are no like barrack complexes or anything like that. So it may have been like these smaller, more temporary or more modest buildings, possibly scattered throughout the town or concentrated in one place. But there's not really much concrete evidence that there was like a big barracks complex or anything like that.
Got it. Oh, well,
this is the leader house.
Yes.
He's got a big banner that's totally not real.
So what?
But yeah, so this, I mean, it expresses the same idea. Like these houses would be sort of compounds built around a courtyard. Even the kings of Sparta didn't really live in palaces or major like glorious buildings or anything like that. They would just have houses like that, and probably not much bigger than these, because anything that stood out from the rest in Sparta was generally considered suspect, and kings in particular were under a lot of scrutiny for, being regularly accused of bribe taking and things like that. So they would be careful not to make their houses too ostentatious.
And as we're exploring, I did want to point out we've come to another one of the few known structures of Sparta. So could you cover what this one is?
Yeah, so this is the round building, which is very sort of very unimaginatively known as the Roundhouse or the round building. which is one of the sites of the Gymnopaidia, which is the festival of the naked ones, literally, which was a festival in honor of Apollo, in which boys carried out public dances. Dancing was a very, very important part of cults in Sparta, so boys would do a lot of practicing for dancing, like dancing as a group, in honor of the god Apollo. So this would be an annual festival in which like young boys of the Spartan citizen class would be able to show off their skills.
Excellent. And right next to it is going to be the Theater of Sparta, which we don't typically think of the Spartans enjoying those types of frivolities as much.
Yeah, although, I mean, there is some evidence that they would have. I mean, it's not very strong, especially for the classical period. There would not have been like a big monumental theater like this with big seats. That's something that was built later on, especially as Sparta became something of a tourist attraction for other people. So people would come down to Sparta to see certain, like particularly brutal Spartan rituals that they inflicted on young boys in this period, which were getting more and more brutal because essentially there was an audience screaming for blood. But in the earlier period, there isn't really that much of a sense that they would do this. They would have a big audience. So if there was a theater, it would have been much more modest. It would have just been sort of a sloping hillside, maybe some wooden benches. But there was some evidence that there was something like that because they found a lot of masks here, like hundreds of little model masks, theater masks, which implies that there was some kind of either ritual or performance being made here.
And for some reason, thinking about the idea of Spartan plays just makes me think of like a stand-up where it's just nothing but one-liners, just pithy little comments like that.
Well, laconic speech was very, very important. And in fact, boys were apparently tested on it. So if they came in their tent groups and their speech was not of a certain standard of like pithiness and cleverness, they would actually get punished for it. So there was social pressure to conform to the way that Spartans were supposed to talk.
Wow.
So I don't know if they really see it as very funny, if it was really something that, you know, was drilled into you from boyhood.
Well, great. Well, let's cap off the tour then with maybe the major temple at the top here.
Yeah, so that's the main temple that you would see, the most monumental temple that would sort of stand out in the landscape, which is the temple of Athena of the Bronze House. Kalkioikos is the name of the temple, and that was really sort of the main temple on the Acropolis at Sparta, which, according to legend, would go all the way back to Tyndareus, the first king of Sparta. But in practice, I mean, obviously it had to be rebuilt many times. Possibly consisted of sort of multiple structures that were sort of connected together. But it was notable for being clad in bronze, which is why it's called the Bronze House. Although we're not entirely sure if that meant the whole structure was coated in bronze, or if, like many other Spartan or many other Greek temples, they would basically be coated with captured shields from war, and so they would give the impression of being sort of these turtles of bronze.
And I think you had said earlier you wanted to remark on the deities or the main religious focus of Sparta as well.
Yeah, so Sparta, I mean, obviously with the way that we have this impression of Sparta being very martial society, which is hugely overstated in pop culture, we tend to assume that, they must have worshipped particularly warlike gods like Ares. They had the local war god Enyalios, and people maybe like Heracles and Zeus. But actually, when you look at the main temples of Sparta, the main ones are like these to Athena. There's one here on the Acropolis to Athena. There are several more down in the town as well. And then the other one, the main cult, is to Artemis Orthia, who was an ancient god, an ancient divinity that we don't really know the origins of, who was eventually equated with Artemis, but it actually started out as just Orthia of unknown origin.
But even for those two named gods, they still have an aspect or an association with war, no?
Well, not necessarily. So Athena, the main aspects that were worshipped here is Athena of the Bronze House, which is just a reference to her temple, and then Athena of the city, basically city protector, which is just a fairly generic way to worship Athena. And then there were a couple of other ones with other sort of not necessarily that warlike aspects, although there is apparently on the Spartan Agora there was at least one statue or shrine to Aphrodite Aria, which is like warlike Aphrodite, if you want. But most of the other temples, they were, Apollo was very important. As I said, Menelaus, as a divine Menelaus, was very important. Talthybios, the deified patron of messengers. The Tindaridae, so Castor and Pollux. Mm-hmm. So there were all sorts of like local heroes, legendary heroes, and deities who weren't necessarily so involved with war per se, just general like deities that were worshipped all over Greece.
Excellent. Well, I think that gives us and the viewers a good idea of what Sparta was all about, and we can definitely return and cover any of these particular areas in more detail. Before we leave, is there anything else you wanted to focus on in the area that we're seeing here, or in general?
We can have a look at the Temple of Artemis Orthia, which is the main sort of temple in the outskirts of the territory there, on the other bank of the Eurotas.
Trying to remember. Ah, that one.
I think it's the big one in the distance there.
Sure, and we'll do a quick jump cut to get the viewers there.
Yeah, so in this territory between these villages, you would normally have like the cemeteries in which the Spartans would have buried their dead, because they would just be built outside of these villages, and therefore they would end up gradually sort of filling up the space between the towns of Sparta. So along these roads, you would have lots of like little like grave stelae, like statues and inscriptions, sort of commemorating the ancient dead. Although the Spartans eventually stopped doing this and no longer built any kind of monumental grave sites. By the classical period, there were laws against that kind of thing.
And you had said, as we're making our way along here, right now it seems like the citizens are more dressed down, but we'd seen previously some people with weapons on them. So you had told me, I think that was actually illegal.
Yeah, so I mean, you weren't allowed to bring weapons into the interior of the Spartan town. So this would not be something you would do. But in any case, I mean, the Greeks considered carrying weapons in public to be a trait of barbarians. So they would not consider that to be civilized behavior for Greek citizens.
Excellent. So now we've made it to the last of the major temples of Sparta. So can you kind of talk us through this one?
Yeah, so this is meant to represent the temple of Artemis Orthia that I mentioned earlier. So this is this weird ancient goddess that was worshipped at Sparta and eventually became the main cult, essentially, of the city and the main tourist attraction of the city as well. Because this is where the Spartans staged this ritual, which in the classical period simply involved boys having to steal cheeses from a table in the temple, which sounds sort of quite cute, except that there were boys with whips, and if you got into their range, you would be brutally beaten. So the trick was to try and steal the cheeses without getting hurt.
And I think I'd heard about that, where to put a little more detail behind it, I think there was teams separated into two. I think it was the older boys defend the temple and the cheese, and the other boys have to raid it. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. So the younger boys were meant to basically display their ability to be agile and cunning to try and get to the cheeses before the boys could hit them. So that's how it starts out, but then over time it becomes more and more brutal. And by the time the Roman period, this is like a tourist attraction where the boys are essentially just lined up at the altar and then whipped until they bleed. And the whole idea is that they're not supposed to make a sound. And the first one to cry basically loses. And apparently some boys tried to endure this to the point of death, so they would actually be beaten to death without giving a squeak, and that's meant to express their ultimate Spartan endurance and indifference to pain. And this is something that people would come from the Roman world and other parts of the Greek world to come and see this happen. And that was all in honor of the goddess of this temple, Artemis Orthia, because of an ancient prophecy where somebody had committed a sacrilege here. And as a result of that, an oracle told them that the only way to worship this goddess henceforth would be to offer human blood at the altar. And so they tried to do this. Initially, they would sacrifice people, allegedly, according to this story. But eventually they decided that the way to do that would be to have these boys whipped to shed blood on the altar.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, so I'm so glad we've been able to visit Sparta. It has prompted so many discussions that wouldn't otherwise fit into a particular video. So this is great, and I wanted to thank you so much for the ride along, and for sure we'll be checking the comments to see if anyone wants us to do a more in-depth tour of Sparta, the surrounding regions, or I can pop on the map here. We have much more potentially to explore if people are interested. So thanks again to the viewers, and thank you, Roel.